Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Will Cooley, who's going to give us a talk entitled Moving Up, Moving Out, the Rise of the Black Middle Class in Chicago, which draws on his recent book of the same title. Dr. Cooley is a very accomplished historian of the 20th century, the 20th century USA, and his principal research interests are on social mobility, race, and class. And he's currently based at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Before I ask Dr. Cooley to begin his talk, I should mention just a few quick housekeeping items. The first of these is that this talk is being recorded. And second, I'm sure Dr. Cooley's talk will stimulate discussion. So we'll have time for questions at the end. And if you have any questions as we proceed, you should feel free to put these into the Q&A. And you can do this anonymously if you wish. And you can do that as we go along if you wish, and we'll pick up those questions at the end. And finally, we've enabled closed captions for this talk, and you can turn these on or off, whichever you prefer. But I should warn you that they're not always entirely accurate. Okay, that's enough from me. And so without further ado, if I can call on Dr. Cooley to begin his talk.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. I am in my basement right now. I was just telling Dr. Horwood that I've been teaching from my basement for about 2 years. I never would have pictured something like this happening, talking to students over a computer screen while being in my basement. My dog has been very confused in these times about what is going on. She doesn't get to be down here while I'm teaching, so she's right on the other side of the door right now, wondering what's happening. So I'm going to open up my PowerPoint. So yes, my presentation today is going to be taken from chapter 3 mainly of my book, which explores the Black middle class in Chicago. A group of folks I think have been really overlooked by scholars, especially in cities. And my main argument overall is that the Black middle class more or less saved Chicago from tearing apart at the seams. I recently heard Chicago described as Detroit slammed into Manhattan. And for those of you with any familiarity with the United States, an incredibly poor city slammed into an incredibly wealthy city. And that's Chicago. The north side is affluent, the south side is not, and the south side is majority Black. And so my overall argument is this city would have been completely ripped apart, and it nearly has been ripped apart numerous times, if not for the influence of this group of strivers, this Black middle class, keeping a lid on things, for better or worse, sometimes. So I'm going to start off with my hook, and it comes from the Urban Institute. The Urban Institute is a think tank here in the States, and with the recent racial reckoning, especially after the murder of George Floyd, right here in Minneapolis, not far from where I'm at in my basement right here, there's been a lot of discussion of how scholars should do their work and how they've done it in the past, and some abuses, some unethical scholarly behaviors. And one thing that came out of the Urban Institute recently talked about community engaged methods. And it caught a lot of attention, a lot of buzz, especially online and in the Twitter sphere, because it named harmful research practices that included objectivity and rigor. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of backlash to this, especially perhaps on the second point. Maybe a lot of scholars should identify their biases more, think about what this means to be objective. However, I'm not sure the opposite would be the best part, in just being subjective, but especially with that point on rigor, what would be the opposite of rigor? That caught a lot of the attention. I want to point more of our attention to another line from this article that came out from the Urban Institute. And again, this is a deeply respected think tank. I study affordable housing and work in that sector a little bit, and I use a lot of the Urban Institute's research. But that quote there, "And if concerns arise from the community, researchers should pause, review, and change the research to reflect what the community wants." I want to examine that quote here throughout my presentation, especially this notion that such a thing as community exists, that it speaks with one voice, that it's quite homogeneous, and that it's usually right, and that scholars should defer to these communities when they're speaking. And this is certainly not just an Urban Institute belief. I have encountered this in so many ways, especially in the last couple of years. Scholars, activists, politicians openly deferring to this thing called community. And if community voices are not represented, then we shouldn't pay any attention to what's going on. It came up recently for me where I talked about the importance of expertise and bringing this scholarly knowledge to try to make change, make policy. And people pushed back hard against that and said, no, expertise is over. What we need is more voices from the community. So let's look at one of these communities. And again, this is in chapter 3 of my book. This would be the community of Chatham on the south side of Chicago. It was in a lower swampy area on the south side, and so it was not developed until after World War II when it was drained. There'd been some efforts to develop it prior to World War II and the Great Depression. And so one person that lived there said you could actually drive around and see the empty basements that they had built during this time, that were built in the 1920s, that then stayed empty until the building boom in the United States after World War II. This community was settled by white Chicagoans. However, it was much more complex in this period than just calling them all white. It was immigrants, people who had been shunned by a lot of communities prior to World War II, Jews, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and they really prided themselves on being this new melting pot on the south side of Chicago. One neighborhood in here called Marynook actually purposefully, intentionally did a Protestant, Catholic, Jewish melting pot on the south side of Chicago. And they would have a rabbi and a priest and a minister come and visit people that moved into this neighborhood to talk about brotherhood. Note, however, this was all white, and African Americans were prohibited from living here either through racial covenants or through racial steering. African Americans were not allowed to live in this new melting pot that definitely tried to forge a new America, but excluded African Americans. I want to point out Chatham here, neighborhood number 44. So on the south side, Chicago is a long city. Chatham is one of those neighborhoods where if you're driving up from the south on the interstate, you hit about 79th Street, 75th Street, and you think, man, I still have a long ways to go before we reach downtown. But very middle class area. You can see these single family homes. Once the trees finally grew up, a very leafy neighborhood, stately apartments, a middle income white neighborhood that embraced all these different ethnicities that had struggled to find housing and acceptance prior to World War II. Now, a lot of folks in here definitely wanted it to remain all white. But African-American middle class, and I give them a lot of credit for changing the demographics of Chicago. This map over here, the black areas are the ones where African-Americans were allowed to live prior to World War II. There's a strip on the south side there. There's some strips on the west side. There are some areas on the far south side where African Americans were allowed to live. Again, racially restricted covenants, but especially violence. And you can see the title of this map is Terrorist Attacks Against Negro Homes in Chicago, May 1944 to August 1946. And each one of those stars is a terrorist attack, white violence against African Americans moving out bravely. They knew exactly what they were getting into. There was no question what was going to happen once they moved into these white neighborhoods. Families would talk about expecting to come home to see their house burned down every day when they would come home from work. Some large-scale riots in Chicago during this time, trying to enforce the color line. And yet these Black pioneers persevered and continued to move out into these neighborhoods that previously were off limits to them. Now, the reason I was drawn to Chatham in my dissertation research is because I came across all these headlines. And I thought, wow, what a great place this Chatham must be. The old joke in Chicago was integration is the time between the first Black family moving in and the last white family leaving. And it could be very rapid. It could be a matter of 2 or 3 years, even less sometimes, that whites would flee these neighborhoods. Once violence was proven futile because Black pioneers kept moving out, these neighborhoods would shift quite quickly. Not so in Chatham. First, African Americans started moving in the mid-50s. There was some violence, there was some resistance, but not anywhere near other neighborhoods. And instead, and maybe partially because a lot of these white folks had moved there knowing they were going to be around people that weren't like them, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Italians, Eastern Europeans. They were more prepared for African Americans. And you see these headlines: a neighborhood can integrate and peaceably, biracial unit wins a battle. It resisted the irresistible and won. That's a very telling one right there, that white flight and segregation were irresistible. And finally, Chatham integration is successful. And this is what drew me to this neighborhood. And I wanted to see it for myself, a successfully integrated neighborhood. How did they build this unity? And it's interesting, even though they were a middle-class neighborhood, they very much relied on the tactics of Saul Alinsky, who was kind of considered a radical in Chicago at this time. I shouldn't say kind of, he was considered a radical at this time. He wrote the Radical Playbook. And his whole idea was that any movement could find unity through shared conflict. And some of his acolytes were quite active in the Chatham neighborhood. And they formed this Chatham Avalon Community Council, which was formed just about the time that African Americans started to move in. In fact, part of the reason it was founded is because a different neighborhood organization said we can keep African Americans out. And a lot of whites were uncomfortable with this and moved into this new council that said, we're going to manage integration here. They didn't necessarily say we're going to welcome a whole bunch of African Americans, but they said they're going to manage it. And people like Thomas Gaudette, who learned from Saul Alinsky, white resident of Chatham, was able to bring in a lot of folks from a lot of different backgrounds and unify around these issues. They were going to fight multifamily housing. This was a middle-class neighborhood that was going to remain a middle-class neighborhood. They voted dry, which is really interesting. In the post-World War II years, nearly everywhere in America was getting rid of prohibition. They voted a whole bunch of precincts dry, chased out taverns, chased out liquor stores from this area. They banned storefront churches. These were seen as a creeping sign that the ghetto was coming closer, that poorer African Americans were coming to the neighborhood. Gaudet has actually said this was the idea of Black middle class residents, that they said this is a way to make sure this neighborhood maintains its middle class status. And the part that they found unity on, but they weren't able to sustain, is trying to figure out how to maintain middle class schools in their middle class neighborhood. And what that meant for Blacks and whites working together here was that colleges that had high schools that had college in mind for their young students, for their young children. So rather amazingly, while many neighborhoods in Chicago are completely falling apart around this issue of integration, Chatham is successful and remains an integrated neighborhood, except it's not at the same time. A lot of white people, this was a highly mobile era, and a lot of white people didn't leave the neighborhood because they had resentments about it becoming integrated, but because people move, and communities during this time were highly mobile. People were having large families, for one thing, and one of the main reasons people would move out is that the houses were considered too small. There was a lot of upward mobility, and so people moved out. Some people did move out for racial reasons. A lot of people just part of this natural turnover. Yet, because of the housing crisis in Chicago, and because of the pent-up demand of the Black middle class, just about every house that was sold was then replaced by a person in the Black middle class. At the same time, there were some folks that left for racial reasons. One of the things that got tossed around during this time, when people would confront whites about why they wouldn't stay in a neighborhood, is they would say, well, I have nothing against middle class Blacks. Let's say Mahalia Jackson, the famous gospel singer, moved next to me. I would be fine with that. It's the lower class African Americans that I want to keep out. Well, Mahalia Jackson moved into this neighborhood, and she was so disappointed that all around her, the for sale signs started popping up the minute she moved in. So there was definitely some racial resentments. There was an act of violence against her house. She actually went on the Edward Murrow show, a famous CBS television show. Edward Murrow came into her home to talk about, hey, this violence is not acceptable. And I know it's not great to put a whole lot of writing on PowerPoints, but I really wanted to share this quote from another Black pioneer who saw people just gradually move out of the neighborhood. At first, I couldn't understand why people were moving out so suddenly. It was like having a tooth pulled for no reason. And then I couldn't understand why people kept leaving, why the individuals who didn't leave right away couldn't see that those of us moving in were at the same economic level, that we had similar values. And there's actually been some studies during this time showing that some of the people moving in were of higher economic status. That this was the upper crust of Black Chicago. Doctors, lawyers, gospel singers, wealthy gospel singers. Mahalia Jackson was quite wealthy, moving in, and yet some whites fled. So steady white flight. By 1963 into 1964 and 1965, Chatham is considered a Black neighborhood. Very few whites remaining. But I think unlike a lot of other studies, my study actually continues to follow what happened to the neighborhood once it became all Black. And this gentleman right here, a scientist, is the first Black president of the Chatham Avalon Park Community Council. And what's really interesting is that if you just look at the actions and the minutes and the notes of the council, you cannot tell when it goes from being a white organization to an integrated organization to a Black organization, because the agenda stays almost exactly the same. Protect this middle-class neighborhood for the people who are living here. And they got a lot of criticism for this. Welton Taylor, who was the first Black president, again, the long quote here, but he said that the Black middle class needed to accept responsibility for the problems that affect the community. He left no doubt that African Americans, upwardly mobile African Americans, needed to look out for other African Americans. But you can see his rather large however here. However, a neighborhood is primarily for the people who live in it. We can't run it for transients who have no stake in the community beyond the bottles they leave on lawns on Sunday morning. If that's snobbery, I'm a snob. The agenda pretty much stayed the same, even though they were getting a ton of criticism from poor and working class African Americans, especially over the issues that they kept going when it became a Black neighborhood. So for instance, more voting dry. More of Chatham precincts were voted dry. The big fear here, and this is a fear very much about racist strictures in Chicago, is that these taverns would become haunts for organized crime. And Black Chicagoans had seen this over and over and over. Organized crime allowed to operate within Black communities. The police would look the other way. They were getting paid off, of course, by Chicago's outfit. Open prostitution, open gambling within these establishments, sometimes even spilling out into the street. A lot of African Americans said they moved out of those neighborhoods because they could not stand the vice that was allowed to operate within them. And so when they moved out, they decided we're not going to let these bars and these brothels follow us out there. Banning storefront churches. And even when these organizations become all African American, you look at the minutes and what they were trying to do for their neighborhood, and it would be things like mosquito abatement, better street lighting, banning storefront churches. They really did see these, a lot of folks anyways, as lower class establishments that would bring lower class African Americans into these neighborhoods. Never mind that some of the upper crust Black churches had themselves started in storefronts, sometimes just years earlier, before they were able to buy formerly white churches. They did not want them in their neighborhoods. And then the one that became most controversial, blocking multifamily housing. Again, we have to consider the strictures of a racist city here. As soon as African Americans started to move into these middle-class neighborhoods, some of which had open land, politicians started to think this is where we can put public housing and multifamily, low-income multifamily housing to house the growing number of African Americans moving from the South. It's a massive housing crisis in Chicago that's falling heaviest on African Americans, especially after World War II. Nothing built in the Great Depression, nothing built during World War II, and yet people continue to move to Chicago. So you can imagine how these African American middle-class residents felt that as soon as they start to establish themselves in these nicer areas, politicians immediately start saying, how can we get more public housing into these areas? And they only had to look north a little bit to see what people recognized as a disaster almost immediately. The Robert Taylor homes north of Chatham, built along the interstate, pretty quickly became warehouses for the poor. Chatham middle-class residents understandably wanted nothing to do with this. The other thing that they really worked hard on is when African American residents would buy a house or sometimes a speculator in these neighborhoods and then start to subdivide it into apartments. And they were quite intrusive, going around to these houses and making sure that people were not subdividing them into smaller units that would then bring more people and more lower class people into the neighborhood, and extremely active at the municipal level in passing legislation banning subdividing houses. But again, imagine the amount of criticism they were facing during this time for turning their backs, and a lot of names being called towards these African Americans because they were accused of turning their backs on the Black community overall that needed housing very badly. So this brings me back to that question that we started with on there's a way that researchers can figure out what a community wants, either before it does its research or they do their research, during the research, after the research, that there is this community voice that we can go to and correct some of the abuses of the past. There's just no evidence of this in Chicago, and there's no evidence of this in Chatham. This started out as a white exclusionary neighborhood. Even though they at the time they were patting themselves on the back for being inclusionary, this community was excluding people actively, yet very much thinking themselves as community. Once it became African American, again, very much thinking of themselves as a community, but a community built on exclusion and keeping some people out, perhaps for very good reasons. But that was a major motivator of community. We can see this clearly in the 1960s when the Nation of Islam buys property inside Chatham. It was an empty lot. Again, there's a lot of empty lots. This area had not been fully developed. And the Nation of Islam, which at the time had a Black capitalist mindset, wanted to set up kind of a super center this is one of their supermarkets right here, Your Supermarkets. They were running many businesses in the 1960s. And they wanted to build a sort of a Nation of Islam Black capitalism headquarters right in Chatham. And once again, the neighborhood unites around this issue, keeping the Nation of Islam out. Most middle-class African Americans were Christians. A lot of them saw the Nation of Islam as something foreign. And of course, it had a large following within the Black poor and working classes. And those are not the types of folks they wanted living in Chatham. And they fight it all the way to City Hall. It's a long story full of corruption and double dealing. And they're able to condemn the area and turn it into a park, which became Nat King Cole Park, and block the sale to the Nation of Islam. Never mind that just a couple of years earlier, the community had been approached and people asked, do you want a park in this empty lot? And the community overwhelmingly said, no, we do not want a park because that's going to attract undesirables. It's going to attract people from outside the community to come to this neighborhood. So just a couple of years earlier, they had said no to the park. Now they said, we absolutely need a park. And this is why you have to block the Nation of Islam from moving in. But I'm using words like unity and how this unified the community. Even within the community, big discussions about whether this was the right thing, the fair thing to do. And this gentleman right here was one of the leaders of the Chatham Avalon Park Community Council. He resigned during this situation because he was also a lawyer for the Nation of Islam. And he viewed this as anti-religious bigotry in trying to keep out the Nation of Islam. George Leighton, pretty famous person in Chicago, one of those guys that has things named after him now. But it got really contentious. The Nation of Islam, of course, was pretty well known for showing up with their bodyguards, rather intimidating force. The Chatham Avalon Park Community Council would also show up for municipal hearings, and they would recruit all the policemen. Policemen were some of the, and other municipal workers were some of the pioneers into these neighborhoods. So they would recruit policemen to stare down the Nation of Islam at these highly contentious meetings. But even within the community, people were not always okay with all of this exclusion. And so I'm using words like unity, but that glosses over how much dissension there was within these communities as well. And I think it is important to recognize that it's fairly easy to caricature these African-American middle-class residents, and they certainly were at the time. All sorts of names thrown at them. One of the painful things for them as they got older was their own children. We're labeling them Uncle Toms or sellouts as the next generation became more radicalized. Black Babbitts is the term that comes up a lot after the famous novel of the prototype middle-class person, closed-minded middle-class person. They were called Black Babbitts, but it's much more complex than that. One study from the early 70s, mostly drawn from Black middle-class people in this area, 45% of high-status Blacks belong to civil rights organizations. That's the highest of any group. In a lot of cases, they were forming the leadership cadre of these civil rights organizations within Chicago, funding them, providing lawyers, providing manpower, especially with the schools. And they had a vested interest here in making sure that their kids were getting the same attention that the white kids got when they were still living in these neighborhoods. And so very active in the civil rights demonstrations of the 1960s and 1970s. So let's come all the way back here to where I started and talk about what I found rather disturbing, that researchers actually can go to the community and find a single community voice, and then should have that community voice dictate the scholarship. And again, I don't think it's just the Urban Institute. I'm seeing this from a lot of scholars, especially when it comes to this issue of violence and crime and police violence within these communities. Again, this has gone worldwide, so many of you probably know this, even though you're in the UK. This is right down the road from me in Powderhorn Park. After the George Floyd murder, some Minneapolis City Council people pledged to defund the police early November. There's a ballot issue here in Minneapolis that the wording is rather ambiguous, but would more or less start the process of dismantling the Minneapolis Police Department and replacing it with something that we're not quite sure, because they haven't really laid out what will be next, but some other sort of public safety apparatus. And what's really interesting is how all sides are saying that the community is on their side on this issue. And almost all sides are arguing that the community speaks with one voice, that the community is homogenous, racially homogenous, which, you know, there's definitely big pockets of segregation here, but even the most segregated neighborhoods in Minneapolis often include several different races. And that the community should tell us what to do. And that experts and researchers should sort of step aside in this situation. And I think that's the wrong road to go down. I think it sidelines the type of history that I tried to present here in what communities actually do and what they look like. It ignores the way that communities often actively seek to exclude people. In Chatham, it started out as what they thought as an inclusive neighborhood that was actually quite exclusionary towards African Americans. Some of that exclusion continued, even though it may have been justified, Black middle-class people trying to keep out poor and working class folks. I'm involved with one of these neighborhoods right now in a grant writing role, and the neighborhoods themselves that are facing high crime are quite open that they want to exclude people. The way to bring crime down is to exclude the people that are creating the problems. There was a meeting we had recently in a high crime neighborhood, and we discussed what are we going to do about open drug dealing in this neighborhood. And one of the answers from the community was, well, we'll push them into another neighborhood. And that was their big solution, right? And you know, as a scholar, we have to understand where people are coming from. But that, of course, is not a long-term solution to the problem of open-air drug dealing. But most dangerously, I really worry that for those of you in the UK, this is sort of echoing David Cameron's Big Society, where it used to be conservatives in the United States would say, well, I don't have to worry about these problems because the community should solve them themselves. They should pull themselves up by the bootstraps and solve these problems. And that's what's happened ever since Reagan was elected here, and probably for you with Thatcher. Communities should solve these problems on their own, and we're not going to help. Now I feel like there's some forces on the left and liberals that are in this as well, that they really do believe that the community, and these are poorly resourced, highly segregated neighborhoods that have been ignored and sidelined for decades, can somehow solve these problems on their own. It's throwing them overboard and expecting that they could do all these things when the problems they face are tremendous. And our federal government has invested in white communities and whiteness for decades, if not centuries. So it seems strange to hear folks say, well, now we're going to turn to the community to come up with their own solutions. And not surprisingly, a lot of downtown business interests get really excited when they hear things like community solutions, because it leaves them off the hook to really have sound structural changes that we need here. So thank you so much. That's where I'll stop.
Okay, thank you very much. That was extremely interesting, and particularly is that it actually touched on a number of issues which are pertinent to the UK, I think. So thank you very much for that. And if anybody's got any questions, then please put them in the Q&A, and I'll convey them to Dr. Cooley. I have a quick question for starters. I think you suggested at the end that actually, I think you were talking about businesses, that they actually might be fairly enthusiastic about the idea that this kind of decision making or problem solving should be centered in the community. I'm wondering if that's true for maybe federal or state or local government as well, that it lets them off the hook also. And the particular reason why I say this is I think that is something that was behind David Cameron's Big Society, because it was associated with what was called austerity here, which was essentially a withdrawal of the government from social provision in the UK. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, and I've definitely been awakened to that in this grant writing role for this neighborhood in Minneapolis. The grant is pushing us towards community solutions. What can we do in the community? What ideas are popping up from the community, which on one hand is good, because there needs to be more voices and fewer just less of the law enforcement, especially just imposing its will on these neighborhoods. However, it definitely, I mean, the amount of money is a pittance. One of the things that comes back from the community and from people involved here is jobs program, a massive jobs program that would put people to work who are in danger, who are of ending up victims of homicide, ending up in a life of crime. The kind of money the federal government is offering here would not even come close to the kind of real jobs program that is absolutely necessary for long-term fixes for these neighborhoods. So I think you're completely correct that it's a way for the federal government to throw a little bit of money. And you say, well, it's $1 million grant. That doesn't seem like a little bit of money, but it is in terms of like really creating structural change. It's nothing compared to what these neighborhoods would actually need to lessen their crime problems. And I've certainly noticed this going back to the 1980s on how excited the government and downtown business interests got on community policing. Communities should solve these problems on their own, and if they can't, well, it was the community's fault, and there's nothing we can do about it, right? And to your point on David Cameron, the amount of volunteer work that they think that poor, marginalized communities should be able to do is astounding. They would never ask that much of a wealthy community, even, that people are just going to volunteer their time and effort in stuff like volunteer crime control. But when it comes to And this is where we fetishize the community. They think, well, everybody has this interest in the community and they'll just willingly give up their time to do this. I don't know how it worked out with the big society in the UK, but it's not going to work here.
Well, I don't think we talk about the big society anymore. That disappeared. But it strikes me that there are echoes here, and obviously it falls into part of the period that you're talking about of the Great Society programs in the United States, which in a sense, I think are the reverse of the big society, because they do involve a lot of federal money, but they also have some things which are a bit like this, don't they? Because they have the community action programs, which as I understand it, were in some ways a way of suggesting, or you're going to do all these things to improve the life of communities, but actually you're going to leave it to the communities and they're going to do it all. And then in the end, actually, when they try and do it all, their participation in those community action programs is yanked, because then they're too radicalized, I think, as far as the federal government's concerned.
Yeah, certainly. In the 1960s and into the 1970s, when the federal government realized that maximum feasible participation would mean participation of things like street gangs or Black Panthers, then they said, whoa, right, we did not mean those folks participating, right? Yeah. And even today, giving a voice to the people who are pulling a trigger and just asking them, well, why are you pulling a trigger? That's off the table. We're not going to the folks that are actually involved in these situations. I mean, Minneapolis is on its way, unfortunately, to possibly a record number of homicides. 1995 was the worst for Minneapolis when it was called Murderapolis. It looks like it might be headed that way now. And we should be trying to figure out, why is this happening? But we're not investing in that part of the community. And that is part of the community. One of the things that's come up at these grant writing meetings is there is a neighborhood, a very small neighborhood within the community, where drug dealing and vice is entrenched. It's so entrenched that the homeowners in the area are actually making money off renting to drug dealers. They're a part of the whole situation. That's community too, but no one wants to talk about that part of community, and it's very difficult to rid a marginalized community of these money-making operations. Drug dealing, even today, not as much as it used to be, but drug dealing still makes revenue for some people.
I should remind people that if they have any questions, they should put them in the Q&A. I don't think anybody has given us any questions yet. And I don't want to monopolize things, but just another one or another issue. You're presenting a picture of Black middle class Americans, and we understand them as being middle class because their vision of middle class sounds pretty much like that of white middle class Americans. And you did refer to this, that actually they were criticized for this, and maybe criticized by their own children, who became more radicalized in the later 60s, with the advent of Black Power, etc. I just wondering if you could say a bit more about that, that these people were conforming to a middle class perspective, and that criticism that's, well, Uncle Tomism.
Right. Yeah, and that definitely stung for the people that I talk about in the book, as you mentioned, especially when it comes from their own children who are more interested in organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which has a strong critique of Black middle class people. Black Panthers are active in Chicago. But they had a good retort for this, because I think there were a lot of publications at this time, and sometimes even from Black middle class publications like Ebony or Jet, that would accuse them of being somehow buffered from the worst of racism due to their privilege. And they would come back and say, no, I face this every day. Unlike African Americans who live in all African American poor and working class neighborhoods, I'm integrating on a daily basis, because a lot of these folks were entering white spaces, for instance, on a daily basis. Well, one of the Black middle class strivers I detail is Chuck Harrison, who was an industrial designer and the first industrial designer to be hired at Sears, which is the venerable Chicago retailer. And at first, he just had to do freelance work in the early 60s because they wouldn't hire African Americans. And then there's a breakthrough, a manager who really wants his expertise is able to hire him first African American and usually only African American working at Sears. And he would talk about every day when he would get to work, he would put on his fake gas mask because it was going to be such a toxic workplace for him. So they would come back quite strongly and say, you know, we're often the only Black face in so many of these situations. And they would talk about like the daily indignities whenever something would happen in Black America. They were immediately asked, like, what's going on, right? What's going on with this H. Rap Brown character? Or why does Dr. King want this? And they were expected to answer because they were the only African Americans. So I certainly, yes, they would not trade places with someone living in a poor, segregated area. But it's not like they were facing, especially when they moved into these neighborhoods, they were facing racism head on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we do have a question. This is somebody who says that they've recently finished reading Michelle Obama's autobiography, in which she addresses questions of housing access and class distinction, recalls working for the city of Chicago and for various non-profit organizations, as well as the challenge of federal interventions in solving structural inequality. And they're asking, have you read that book, and what did you make of her rendering of class in Chicago?
Yeah, and I have not read her book. My wife just finished it, and she put it in my room, and so it's on the bookshelf. I just have not got it to it yet. But her family, of course, is a fascinating case of upward mobility. I mean, people have been able to track her family back to a slave cabin in South Carolina and trace upward mobility, followed by those Jim Crow years, and downward mobility, and then moving to Chicago and things opening up, and incredible struggles to advance Michelle and her brother Craig. Her brother Craig was actually my cousin's basketball coach at Brown University. But what I think this talks about is the importance of access to decent education, because both Michelle, and this is why the Black middle class struggled so hard for maintaining standards in schools, because they saw it over and over and over. When the last white families left, the Chicago public schools would no longer pay attention to those schools. And I think they felt like it was a matter of survival. They had to do something to maintain the middle-class, college-oriented nature of these schools that Michelle and Craig definitely benefited from, and it was able to propel them into these rather elite spaces. Because I think those of you probably, her family was I would say even working class, right? I mean, municipal workers for the most part, but often just barely getting by. And what really moved them up was that access to education. And I think Michelle's talked about this so much that it's clear not all kids in Chicago have this access. And she got lucky in a way, but it was not just luck, it was the Black middle class striving to make sure that there were these spaces for upwardly mobile African Americans in Chicago. It was not social democracy, right? It was racial democracy. Most of these folks did believe in capitalism. They were not socialists. So they had a view of Chicago that you're going to be rewarded, but you're going to have to put a lot of effort into it. It was, we would probably call it a conservative view, but they would definitely not consider themselves conservatives.
Well, thanks for that, and thank you very much for the question. If anybody else has got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. The person who asked that question says, thanks very much for that response. It really does speak to what she writes about and her depiction of education. So thanks for that. Another one from me, this is just a point of clarification, I think. You talked about racially restricted covenants depriving Black citizens of the possibility of living in certain areas, and I'm pretty familiar with the kind of technical aspects of kind of economic exclusion from areas, but I just wondered, how did those racially orientated covenants work?
Yeah, and yeah, I apologize for that because I don't think they were widespread in England. I'm not aware of them. I'm not aware of them in any other country, but it would be written right into the deed, starting in the 1910s and 1920s, that this house could not be sold or often rented by anyone not of the Caucasian race. And they varied by area. Some excluded Jews. Once in a while, you'd see one that would exclude Italians. A lot of times they would exclude Asians. So the wording was different, but always excluding African Americans. And so besides the violence, they had to overcome this legal hurdle that it was not legal for middle-class African Americans to buy in these neighborhoods. The house I'm in right now has one of these racial covenants from it was built in the 1920s. If you were in the city, on the fringe of the city or in the suburbs, it's almost a guarantee that the house was racially restricted. And so there was a ton of resources put into lawyer fees to try to overcome these racially restrictive covenants. But I think one of the things that I want to stress from my book is that it never stopped them. The Black middle, it halted their progress. It slowed, I shouldn't say halted, it hindered their progress. It never stopped African Americans from moving out into these neighborhoods. So almost all the houses they bought had these deeds in them, but then they were overcome by just unwillingness of Black pioneers to accede to racism. And then in 1948, the Supreme Court says the government cannot enforce them, but they're still okay to put in your deed.
Okay.
So is another one of those classic examples of the federal government like washing its hands of the problem, but then allowing it to continue. So even after 1948, you still see them popping up, and the white real estate industry immediately shifts into overdrive, trying to figure out how they're going to maintain racially exclusive spaces without these deeds. But yeah, it was called the Iron Ring of Housing in Chicago, where all these Black neighborhoods were surrounded by white neighborhoods with racially restrictive covenants in them. And so it'd be things like, you can only have your fence this high, you can't have farm animals, and no Black people, right? And that kind of extreme racism that we see in these areas.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody have any more questions? Well, if there are no questions, I think it just remains for me to thank Dr. Cooley for what I thought was a really excellent and really interesting talk. So thank you so much for sharing part of your book with us, and that was really enjoyable. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Horwood, and thanks to the audience. And I really appreciated being here, and it was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to bring this webinar to an end if nobody has any further questions. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending.